I think one of the first big moments was we had organized a potluck with Brian Moran, who was running for Virginia governor. And it was before a public hearing. And we had really put together this beautiful country potluck, and everyone brought food and provided, tables and all of this, and the press was there, and it was just this beautiful, glorious day. And we had some time before the press conference, or I'm sorry, we had some time after the press conference and the potluck before the public hearing started. And so there was a moment, like every hostess does, where you've thrown the party and you sit down with your girlfriends and you pick up your cup of coffee or your sweet tea and you say, whew, oh, we did it. Oh my gosh, wow. And did you see how they loved the, fruit punch? Or, did you see when Brian Moran, did this? And oh, wasn't he dreamy? And we were just having a minute on a blanket. And one of the professional organizers came up to us and said, people are starting to come in for the public hearing. You all need to get up and start working the door. And there was a huge just, wow moment, Out of everyone who was there at that moment, I was probably the youngest at 41, or whatever I was at the time, 40, 39. The organizer, the professional who had said that to us was much younger. I mean, young enough to be some of these people's daughter, granddaughter. And so there was a real disconnect in terms of how one speaks to an elder in a Southern community. I didn't grow up in the South, but you pick up on those sorts of things, And we said to her, as sort of politely as we could manage, look, these are employees. These are ODAC employees coming. The public hearing is not to start for another hour and a half, whatever it was. It was a good long time. And we said, we just need a minute. I mean, we just pulled off a party, a fete. We had this huge thing. We just need a minute, and the kids were all kind of running around, and she just wouldn't stop. She just would not let it go. And eventually tried to sort of pull rank and say, we're the professionals. We know how to run these sorts of campaigns. This is what we did on our last campaign. And if you don't do this, then basically I just throw my hands up about the whole thing. And it was shocking on a number of levels. On an interpersonal level, it felt very disrespectful. On a marathon level, it felt very disrespectful. You're asking us to do this work. And they had asked us to do this potluck with Brian Moran at a time when we were saying we really cannot pull this off. And they had sort of said, look, this is vitally important. You have got to do this thing and we will help you. To then be told, you get up and go do more was just a punch in the face, And so what happened after that, and we stood our ground, we continued to sit there. But those women were not happy about the way that we had been approached. I wasn't, and I think that level of personal interaction, to not understand that already as an outsider, already as a young person, already as an environmentalist, you come in with certain stereotypes that aren't great in small rural southern communities like this, you know? And so that lack of awareness was very problematic. Later on at that public hearing, another thing that had happened was this sort of in-your-face approach, and we were not there yet. You know, when you think about how these fights go, you know, no one starts out chaining themselves to something and getting arrested. You start out really polite. You start out with the expectation that I'm going to show up and my elected officials are going to listen to me and it's all going to be very above board and reasonable. And then that doesn't happen. And then you come back a little bit angrier, and then you come back a little bit angrier, and you progress to the point of desperation where, okay, it's now get arrested, it's now chain myself to something. We were at the very beginning of politely approaching, we as a community. And I, you know, now in hindsight, now that I'm a little further along, you know, that road, you know, these were people who had just come off a coal plant fight, a campaign, and they weren't at the beginning of that journey, you know, with us. They were trying to sort of meet in the middle, and they wanted us to come into this hearing with the big yard signs, these big, bold, black and white yard signs, and we said, that will be so offensive. We didn't know where the rest of the council stood. And they said, well, this is what you've got to do. And we said, we can't do that. Even if they're on our side, even for the people who we knew on that council who were our allies, they said it too. That would have been so offensive. It would have been so in your face for where we were. Now, potentially years later, that would be an effective thing to do. Not meeting us where we were in this fight was very problematic. And I don't know that I could go into another community and not want them to escalate to the point where I am now on the journey. I don't know. I imagine that's a really hard line to walk. But it needed to happen strategically. And there were times that it didn't. And that was tough. And we then ran into the interpersonal stuff.